Damascus, 1960. A stranger walks into the Syrian Ministry of Defense carrying flawless credentials. Within 2 years, he'll be attending top-secret military briefings. Within 4, he'll have access to Syria's most classified war plans. Within 6, he'll be smoking cigars with the men planning Israel's destruction, while transmitting every word back to Tel Aviv. This is the story of Eli Cohen, the accountant from Alexandria who became Syria's most trusted insider. A man so convincing that Syrian generals would invite him to tour the Golan Heights fortifications. So valuable that Mossad built their entire intelligence apparatus around his reports. And so deeply embedded that when he was finally caught, it would shake both nations to their core. Before we dive in, I want to hear from you. Would you have what it takes to live as someone else for years, knowing one mistake means death? Drop your answer in the comments. Let's go back to where it started, not in Damascus, but in a modest apartment in Tel Aviv, where a frustrated businessman was about to gamble his life on an impossible lie. Eli Cohen had failed at being ordinary. The accounting firm in Israel wasn't working out. His wife Nadia watched him grow restless, pacing their small apartment, chain-smoking through the nights. She didn't know what ate at him, only that something did. At 37, he seemed like a man running out of time to become whoever he was supposed to be. What Nadia didn't know was that Eli had already tasted the other life. In Egypt, before their marriage, before they'd fled to Israel, he'd worked for Israeli intelligence, nothing dramatic, dead drops, message relays, low-level reconnaissance. But it had meant something. It had made him someone. Then the Lavon affair exploded. Israeli agents in Egypt got caught. Networks burned. Names surfaced. Eli and Nadia left Egypt in 1957 with whatever they could carry. 3 years later, he was still trying to convince himself that accounting mattered. The letter from Mossad arrived on a Tuesday morning in January 1960. No preamble, no pleasantries, just a time and an address in North Tel Aviv. Eli didn't tell Nadia where he was going. He put on his best suit and drove to a nondescript office building that could have housed insurance agents or import-export firms or the machinery of state secrets. The meeting lasted 40 minutes. When Eli walked out, he had committed to something that would consume the next 5 years of his life. Mossad wanted a ghost. Not a spy passing through Damascus on a quick mission. Not an agent gathering intelligence for a few months before extraction. They wanted someone who would become Syrian. Live Syrian. Think Syrian. Bleed Syrian. Until the day came when they needed him to betray everything he'd built. The training started the next morning in a sealed facility outside Tel Aviv. The first thing they did was kill Eli Cohen. Officially. Bureaucratically. Every record scrubbed. Every connection severed. His friends would be told he'd taken a job abroad, vague corporate work in South America, nothing suspicious, nothing worth investigating. The second thing they did was birth Kamel Amin Thabet. Kamel's story had to be perfect because it would be checked. He was a Syrian emigrant who'd left Damascus for Argentina in the late 1940s, making his fortune in import-export. Wealthy enough to be interesting, connected enough to matter. But not so successful that anyone would dig too deeply into his financial records, which Mossad's document specialists were currently fabricating in Buenos Aires. The cover required more than papers. Eli spent 8 months learning to be Kamel. The Argentine accent overlaying his Arabic, the business terminology of import-export trade. The politics of Buenos Aires expatriate communities. The casual references to Damascus neighborhoods he'd supposedly grown up in. The names of schools and teachers and streets that had to roll off his tongue without hesitation. They taught him radio operation on equipment, small enough to hide in a briefcase. Burst transmission protocols that could send an entire page of intelligence in seconds. Encryption methods using one-time pads that Syrian codebreakers couldn't crack. Dead drop procedures. Emergency extraction protocols. Everything a deep cover agent needed to stay alive and keep transmitting. But the most important training was psychological. Mossad's instructors broke down every habit that marked Eli as Israeli. The way he held his cigarettes, the casual Hebrew phrases that peppered his Arabic, the Sabbath reflexes ingrained from childhood. All of it had to go. Kamel Amin Thabet would be Muslim. He would pray 5 times daily. He would drink and smoke and chase women, and do everything a wealthy Syrian playboy living abroad might do. And he would do it so naturally that even in moments of stress, even when exhausted or drunk or terrified, the mask would never slip. By September 1960, Eli Cohen barely existed. Kamel Amin Thabet had consumed him entirely. The man who boarded a flight to Buenos Aires that month looked confident, prosperous, comfortable in his expensive suit and Italian shoes. He carried business cards for an import-export firm that had existed for exactly 6 months. Long enough to appear legitimate, new enough that its records wouldn't withstand serious investigation. Not that anyone would investigate. Not yet. Buenos Aires in 1960 was a city of refugees, Europeans fleeing the war's aftermath, Arabs who'd left during the regional upheavals, Nazis who'd bought new identities with stolen gold. The Argentine government asked few questions about anyone's past, which made it perfect for building a legend. Kamel rented a fashionable apartment in Palermo. He joined the Syrian Expatriate Club, a social organization where displaced Damascenes gathered to smoke hookah and complain about life in South America while refusing to return home. He spent money, not obscenely, just enough to signal success, lunches at good restaurants, memberships at the right clubs, donations to expatriate causes. The Syrian community noticed him quickly, a businessman doing well, single, generous with drinks and stories. The kind of man people wanted to know. Within 3 months, Kamel had become friends with Major Amin al-Hafez, a Syrian military attaché stationed at the embassy in Buenos Aires. This wasn't accident. Mossad had identified al-Hafez as a rising figure in Syrian military intelligence, ambitious, connected, and politically astute. The kind of officer who would climb high in Damascus if the political winds blew right. Befriending him was the mission's first objective. Al-Hafez liked Kamel immediately. The businessman threw excellent parties at his Palermo apartment. He knew how to listen when military men needed to vent about their postings. He never asked suspicious questions, never pushed too hard for information. He was simply there, reliably friendly, always ready with expensive whiskey and genuine interest in Al-Hafez's complaints about Argentine bureaucracy. The friendship deepened over late-night conversations that stretched until dawn. Al-Hafez talked about Damascus politics, the endless coups and counter-coups that plagued Syria's government. He talked about the military's frustrations with civilian leadership. He talked about Israel, the permanent enemy, the existential threat, the obsession that consumed every Syrian military planner's waking hours. And Kamel listened, absorbing every detail, memorizing every name, mapping the political landscape he would soon enter. In his apartment, alone after Al-Hafez left, Kamel assembled his radio. The components had arrived separately in packages mailed from various European cities, an antenna hidden inside a lamp, the transmitter disguised as a transistor radio, the one-time pads concealed in a hollowed-out book. He waited until 3 a.m, when Buenos Aires slept and radio interference was minimal, then sent his first operational burst to Tel Aviv. The message was brief: contact established with Al-Hafez, friendship progressing. Subject responsive to social approach, no suspicion detected. Building foundation for Syrian introduction. Kamel requesting approval for next phase. Tel Aviv's response came 2 nights later during the agreed transmission window. Proceed as planned. Cultivate Al-Hafez relationship. Prepare for Damascus insertion within 6 months. Exercise maximum caution 6 months. Kamel threw himself into the role with obsessive precision. He expanded his business operations, creating paper trails that would withstand basic investigation. Shipping manifests for textile imports that actually existed. Bank transfers through legitimate Argentine accounts. Tax payments to prove his business was real. The more genuine Kamel's life appeared, the less anyone would question him when he arrived in Damascus. He also deepened his immersion in the Syrian expatriate community, not just attending their gatherings, but becoming essential to them. He organized charity drives for Syrian refugees. He hosted cultural events celebrating Damascus traditions. He became known as a man proud of his heritage, eager to reconnect with home despite his success abroad. The perfect profile for someone planning to return. By early 1961, the political situation in Damascus had shifted dramatically. A military coup had brought new officers to power, and Major Amin al-Hafez was being recalled from Buenos Aires. He would return to a posting in Syrian military intelligence with significant access to strategic planning. Before he left, he made Kamel a promise. When the businessman finally decided to come home to Syria, al-Hafez would personally ensure he received the welcome he deserved. The promise was exactly what Mossad had been cultivating for 18 months. An invitation to Damascus, not as a suspicious foreigner requiring security vetting, but as a trusted friend of a rising military officer. The perfect cover for penetration. Kamel waited 3 months after al-Hafez's departure before making his move. Rushing would seem suspicious. A successful businessman doesn't abandon Argentina on impulse. So he spent the spring of 1961 loudly discussing homesickness at expatriate gatherings. He talked about missing Damascus, about wanting to contribute to Syria's development now that he'd made his fortune, about feeling the pull of home after years abroad. In July 1961, Kamel Amin Thabet boarded a ship from Buenos Aires to Beirut. He traveled by sea rather than air, giving himself weeks to inhabit the role completely. By the time the ship docked in Lebanon, Eli Cohen had ceased to exist, even in his private thoughts. There was only Kamel now. Kamel with his Argentine suits and Argentine accent and Argentine money. Kamel who sent a telegram to Major al-Hafez in Damascus, announcing his arrival and requesting permission to visit his homeland. The response came within 24 hours. Al-Hafez would arrange everything: papers, permits, introductions to the right people. His friend Kamel would be welcomed home properly. The drive from Beirut to Damascus took 6 hours through mountain roads that carved between Lebanon and Syria. Kamel crossed the border with forged papers that identified him as a Syrian national returning from business abroad. The border guards barely glanced at his documents. One look at his expensive luggage and the customs stamp from the military attaché's office was enough. Wealthy expatriates with connections didn't get hassled. Damascus sprawled before him as the car descended from the mountains, ancient and modern crashing together. Minarets rising above concrete government buildings. The souks bustling with merchants alongside new Western-style shops. Military checkpoints on major intersections. Soldiers watching civilians with the permanent suspicion of a security state. Al-Hafez met him at a cafe in the Baramke district. The major had gained weight since Buenos Aires, and a certain hardness around the eyes that came from working in military intelligence. But his greeting was warm. He embraced Kamel like a brother, kissed both cheeks, ordered coffee and sweets while catching up on the months since they'd last met. The real conversation started after pleasantries. Al-Hafez leaned forward, voice dropping. Damascus was dangerous for a man without protection, he explained. The security services watched everyone, foreigners especially. Even returning Syrians attracted scrutiny. But al-Hafez had already spoken to the right people. Kamel's background had been quietly vouched for by someone the intelligence services trusted. There would be no problems, no harassment, no surveillance. As far as Syrian security was concerned, Kamel Amin Thabet was exactly who he claimed to be. Kamel rented an apartment in Abu Rumaneh, one of Damascus's better neighborhoods. 4 rooms with a balcony overlooking the street, close to government ministries, close to military headquarters, close to everything that mattered. The location wasn't accident. A successful businessman establishing himself in Damascus would naturally choose a prestigious address. It also put him within walking distance of the people he needed to know. The apartment became his operational base. In the living room, he hosted parties for al-Hafez's military friends. In the bedroom, he assembled his radio and encryption equipment, hidden inside furniture and behind false panels that Syrian security would need a specific reason to find. The transmitter was smaller than the one in Buenos Aires, but more powerful, capable of reaching Israeli receiving stations across the border. He transmitted only during predetermined windows, using burst sends that lasted seconds. Long enough to get intelligence out. Short enough to avoid Syrian radio detection equipment. His first Damascus transmission went out 3 days after arrival. Successful insertion, no security interest. Al-Hafez vouched for cover story, beginning cultivation of military and government targets, requesting contact protocols for local operations. Tel Aviv's response confirmed what he already knew. There was no local network to back him up. The Syrian security services had systematically destroyed Israeli intelligence operations in Damascus over the previous 5 years. Kamel was alone. If he got caught, there would be no rescue, no prisoner exchange, no diplomatic intervention. Israel would deny he existed, and Syria would hang him in a public square. The isolation was both terrifying and liberating. Kamel had no handlers to meet, no contact protocols to maintain, no local agents whose mistakes could expose him. Just the radio transmissions and his ability to build a convincing life. Everything depended on making himself so valuable, so trusted, so thoroughly Syrian that no one would ever question his loyalty. He started by becoming unavoidable. The parties at his apartment grew larger and more frequent. Military officers, government officials, businessmen with regime connections. Anyone who mattered in Damascus eventually received an invitation to one of Kamel's gatherings. He served expensive whiskey, despite Syria's official Islamic character. He provided female companionship for officers whose marriages had grown stale. He created a space where powerful men could relax without the paranoid formality that characterized official interactions in Damascus. And he listened, always listening, never obviously asking questions, but steering conversations toward intelligence value. A general complaining about budget constraints would mention troop deployments. A ministry official frustrated with bureaucracy would name which departments were preparing what policies. A businessman with defense contracts would describe weapons purchases and military equipment shortages. All of it went into Kamel's flawless memory, then onto the radio transmissions that flowed to Tel Aviv every few nights. The intelligence was good enough that Mossad restructured their Syrian analysis around Kamel's reports. He wasn't providing tactical information, troop movements, or imminent attacks. He was providing something more valuable, a comprehensive picture of Syria's military capabilities, political fractures, and strategic planning. The kind of intelligence that could only come from inside the regime's inner circle. By early 1962, 6 months after arriving in Damascus, Kamel had become exactly what Mossad needed. A trusted insider with access to sensitive information and no apparent reason to betray Syria. His cover was holding perfectly. His social position was secure. Syrian intelligence had investigated his background and found nothing suspicious in the fabricated records Mossad had created. As far as anyone in Damascus knew, Kamel Amin Thabet was simply a wealthy businessman who'd returned home to contribute to his nation's development. The first real test came when Al-Hafez introduced him to Colonel Ahmed Swidani, one of Syrian military intelligence's most dangerous officers. Swidani was paranoid, suspicious of everyone, and responsible for rooting out Israeli spies in Damascus. His presence at one of Kamel's parties represented either acceptance or a trap. Kamel played it perfectly. He welcomed Swidani warmly but didn't push. He let the colonel drink and observe and reach his own conclusions. By the end of the evening, Swidani was relaxed, enjoying himself, asking Kamel about business opportunities in import-export. The interrogation he'd likely planned never materialized. Instead, he found a gracious host who showed proper respect for military authority while maintaining his own dignity as a successful civilian. Exactly the kind of man who posed no threat to anyone. The breakthrough came 3 months later, when Al-Hafez was promoted to Deputy Minister of Defense. His rise brought Kamel into proximity with Syria's highest military leadership. Suddenly, the parties at the Abu Rumaneh apartment weren't just gathering mid-level officers. They were attracting generals, strategic planners, the men who made decisions about war and peace with Israel. Kamel expanded his operation accordingly. He established a legitimate business importing European goods into Syria. The business was real, profitable even, and it gave him reasons to travel and meet with officials. It also provided cover for increased radio activity. A businessman might reasonably own sophisticated communications equipment. He might have reasons to transmit messages at odd hours. The legitimate business made the espionage easier to hide. The intelligence flowing to Tel Aviv became extraordinary. Detailed reports on Syrian military doctrine, lists of units stationed along the Israeli border, assessments of Soviet weapons deliveries and training programs, internal debates about when Syria would be ready for war, plans for capturing Israeli territory in the Galilee and Golan Heights, information that would prove critical when war eventually came. But the most valuable intelligence had nothing to do with military hardware. Kamel was mapping the political fault lines within Syria's regime. He identified which officers were loyal to which factions. He reported on growing tensions between the Ba'ath Party and military leadership. He documented coup plots and counterplots that would eventually tear Syria's government apart. Mossad used this intelligence not just to understand Syrian capabilities, but to manipulate Syrian politics, exacerbating divisions and preventing the kind of unified leadership that might successfully wage war against Israel. By 1963, Kamel had become indispensable to Damascus's power elite. Officers sought his advice on personal matters. Officials consulted him about business deals. When visiting dignitaries from other Arab nations came to Damascus, Kamel was often invited to receptions because he represented Syria's successful modern merchant class. The cover had transcended mere acceptance. He'd become an asset to the regime, someone Syrian intelligence actively wanted to protect rather than investigate. This success created its own danger. The deeper Kamel penetrated, the harder it became to maintain the fiction. Every new friendship was another person who might notice something wrong. Every party was another opportunity for the mask to slip. Every conversation required perfect recall of a life he'd never lived. The psychological strain was immense, and Kamel had no way to share it. His transmissions to Tel Aviv were operational only, intelligence reports stripped of personal context. The isolation was total. He managed it by becoming the role completely. When alone in his apartment, he was still Kamel. He thought in Kamel's voice, remembered Kamel's fabricated childhood, inhabited Kamel's personality so thoroughly that Eli Cohen existed only as a distant memory. This complete immersion was what made the cover unbreakable. But it also meant that extracting himself, returning to his real identity, would be psychologically devastating if he survived long enough to try. The operation's scope expanded in late 1963 when Al-Hafez was sent on a special assignment. Syrian military intelligence wanted a comprehensive assessment of their border defenses with Israel, particularly the fortifications on the Golan Heights. Al-Hafez would lead the inspection personally, and he invited his friend Kamel to join him. A civilian perspective would be valuable, he explained. And besides, Kamel had proven himself so loyal to Syria that his discretion was beyond question. Kamel accepted immediately, recognizing the intelligence opportunity. The Golan Heights fortifications were Israel's primary strategic concern. These bunkers and artillery positions dominated northern Israel from elevated terrain. Any future war would require neutralizing them, but Israeli intelligence had incomplete information about their exact locations, defensive capabilities, and garrison strengths. An inspection tour would provide everything Tel Aviv needed to plan military operations. The tour lasted 3 days in December 1963. Kamel traveled with Al-Hafez and a small group of senior officers, visiting fortified positions from the southern Golan to the Syrian-Lebanese border. At each location, they were briefed by garrison commanders on defensive capabilities, weapons stores, communication systems, and contingency plans for Israeli attack. Kamel took no notes. He couldn't risk carrying anything that might be found in a random search. Instead, he memorized everything: coordinates, bunker layouts, artillery ranges, garrison sizes, supply routes. The information accumulated in his head like a detailed map. At one position overlooking the Hula Valley, a colonel explained their strategic doctrine. The fortifications were designed to rain artillery fire on Israeli settlements below, while being virtually impervious to counter-battery fire from lower elevations. Syrian planners expected these positions to be decisive in any future war. They could strike deep into Israeli territory, while Israeli forces struggled to dislodge defenders from hardened bunkers. Kamel stood at the edge of the position, looking down at the green valley below where Israeli farms stretched across the landscape. The officer was right. The strategic advantage was overwhelming. From up here, Syria could devastate northern Israel with minimal risk. Unless someone provided Israel with detailed intelligence on every position, allowing precision strikes that would neutralize the fortifications before war started. That someone, Kamel understood, was him. The tour wasn't just reconnaissance. It was a targeting package that would save thousands of Israeli lives when war inevitably came. Back in Damascus, he spent 2 nights encoding the Golan intelligence into a transmission that would require multiple burst sends. The detail was too extensive for a single broadcast. He broke it into segments, transmitting each one during his regular windows, spacing them across a week to avoid patterns that Syrian radio detection might notice. The information filled pages in Tel Aviv's receiving stations. Precise grid coordinates, sketches of bunker layouts recreated from memory, assessment of defensive capabilities, recommended strike priorities. Mossad's response came in coded acknowledgement: intelligence received, value assessed as critical, continue operations. The dry language concealed what Kamel had just accomplished. He'd provided Israel with the exact information needed to neutralize Syria's primary strategic advantage. When war came, and both sides knew it would come, Israeli forces would strike those fortifications with surgical precision, eliminating the threat before Syrian gunners could devastate Israeli settlements. The Golan Tour had just saved a war, but success brought increased danger. By early 1964, Kamel's position in Damascus society had become so prominent that Syrian intelligence couldn't ignore him, not because they suspected him, his cover remained solid, but because anyone with his level of access represented a potential security vulnerability. Syrian counterintelligence decided to conduct a routine background check. Nothing aggressive, just standard protocol for civilians who regularly interacted with senior military officers. The investigation started in Buenos Aires, where Syrian Embassy staff began making inquiries about Kamel's business history. They contacted the import-export firm he'd supposedly run. They checked banking records and shipping manifests. They interviewed Syrian expatriates who'd known him in Argentina. Everything checked out because Mossad had built the legend so thoroughly. The business existed. The records were real. The expatriates remembered him exactly as his cover story claimed. But one investigator was more thorough than the others. He noticed something odd about the timing of certain shipments, a gap in the records that didn't quite make sense. Nothing conclusive. Just enough irregularity to warrant deeper digging. The investigator requested additional information from European ports where Kamel's business had supposedly operated. The requests would take months to process, but they represented a crack in the cover. Eventually, someone might notice that certain transactions didn't exist, that the paper trail, however detailed, contained subtle impossibilities that would reveal its fabrication. Kamel had no way of knowing the investigation was happening. Syrian intelligence wasn't going to tell him. They were checking his background. He continued his operations normally, hosting parties, cultivating contacts, transmitting intelligence. The threat remained invisible until it was too late to evade. In March 1964, Syrian political dynamics shifted violently. Inqoub brought new officers to power, and Al-Hafez found himself on the wrong side of the political purge. He was arrested, interrogated, stripped of his position. The regime change was brutal and comprehensive, sweeping through the military and intelligence services to eliminate anyone loyal to the previous leadership. Kamel's situation became precarious overnight. His primary protector was gone. The officers who knew him through Al-Hafez were either arrested or keeping their heads down to avoid similar fates. The new regime viewed everyone connected to the old leadership with suspicion. Kamel's social prominence, which had been an asset, now marked him as potentially dangerous, someone whose loyalties needed verification. Syrian intelligence accelerated their investigation. The routine background check became urgent. They wanted to know everything about Kamel Amin Thabet before deciding whether to trust him or arrest him. The inquiries in Buenos Aires intensified. More investigators, more questions, more pressure on expatriates to remember details about the businessman who'd lived among them years ago. In Tel Aviv, Mossad monitored the situation through signals intelligence and other sources in Syria. They recognized the danger. The investigation in Argentina would eventually uncover inconsistencies. Maybe not today or tomorrow, but soon. They sent an encoded message during Kamal's regular transmission window. Situation assessed as deteriorating. Recommend extraction at earliest opportunity. Provide extraction timing preference. Kamal read the message in his apartment, the decoded text in front of him representing an escape route. He could leave. Invent a business emergency requiring travel to Europe. Disappear before Syrian intelligence connected the dots. Survive to fight another day in a different theater. He burned the message and never replied. The operation was too valuable. His access, despite the political upheaval, remained extraordinary. The new regime still needed capable civilians who understood both business and military matters. Kamal had positioned himself as exactly that person, someone whose expertise transcended factional politics. Leaving now would waste 4 years of preparation and sacrifice everything he'd built. More importantly, Israel needed what he could still provide. Syria's new leadership was more radical, more committed to military confrontation with Israel. Their planning was aggressive, their timetable accelerated. The intelligence Kamal could gather in the coming months might be more critical than everything he'd sent previously. Walking away would mean abandoning Israel at the moment when strategic warning mattered most. So, he stayed. He cultivated the new regime's officers with the same patience he'd shown the old leadership. He threw parties for men who'd recently held guns on his previous friends. He adapted to Damascus's brutal political reality, where today's ally might be tomorrow's corpse, and he transmitted intelligence that became increasingly urgent. Troop buildups, weapons purchases from the Soviet Union, strategic planning for coordinated attacks with Egypt and Jordan. Syria was preparing for war, and Kamal was documenting every step. The intelligence was so valuable that Tel Aviv stopped pressing for extraction. They knew the danger. They knew the investigation in Buenos Aires was closing in. But they also knew that Kamal's reporting might be the only thing preventing strategic surprise when Syria attacked. So they let him make the choice, and Kamal chose to stay. By summer 1964, the investigation had produced results. Syrian intelligence had compiled a thick file on Kamal Amin Thabet, and while most of it confirmed his cover story, there were enough inconsistencies to raise serious questions. Certain business transactions that couldn't be fully verified. Gaps in his personal history that seemed suspicious under scrutiny. A pattern of asking questions about military matters that could be explained as friendly curiosity but might indicate intelligence gathering. The file landed on the desk of Colonel Ahmed Swidani, now heading Syrian counterintelligence operations. Swidani remembered Kamal from the parties, the wealthy businessman who'd always been gracious and respectful. But Swidani was also paranoid by profession, and the file's inconsistencies bothered him. Not enough to warrant arrest? Not yet. But enough to justify surveillance. Syrian intelligence began watching Kamal in September 1964. Nothing obvious. No overt tales or harassment. Just quiet observation of his movements, monitoring of his communications, occasional searches of his apartment when he was away. They were looking for evidence that would either confirm his innocence or prove he was working for Israel. Kamal detected the surveillance within a week. He'd been trained to recognize the signs, the same faces appearing too often, unusual activity near his apartment, subtle indicators that his living space had been searched. His radio equipment remained hidden behind false panels that the searches hadn't found, but the surveillance made transmission increasingly dangerous. He adapted by reducing his communication frequency. Instead of several transmissions per week, he sent only one every 10 days, condensing intelligence into longer messages that required more time to transmit, but reduced the chances of being caught broadcasting. The strategy worked for a while. Syrian radio detection equipment wasn't sophisticated enough to track his brief bursts, especially when he varied his transmission times and frequencies. But the surveillance had another effect. It limited Kamal's movements and made him more cautious about gathering intelligence. He couldn't visit military installations without explaining why. He couldn't ask too many questions without seeming suspicious. His effectiveness degraded as Syrian counterintelligence tightened their observation. The operation was slowly strangling itself. In December 1964, Syrian investigators in Buenos Aires finally found what they were looking for. A shipping manifest that didn't match Kamal's business records. A transaction date that conflicted with other documentation. The inconsistency was small, but irreconcilable. Someone had fabricated part of Kamal's history, and the fabrication had just become visible. The report reached Damascus in January 1965. Suidani read it carefully, then made his decision. Kamal Amin Thabet would be arrested and interrogated. If he was innocent, the inconsistencies could be explained. If he was an Israeli spy, the interrogation would extract a confession. Either way, the uncertainty would end. On the morning of January 18, 1965, Syrian security forces surrounded Kamal's apartment building. They waited until he returned from a morning walk, then moved in as he climbed the stairs to his floor. No drama, no gunfight. Just 6 men with weapons drawn, blocking his path, informing him he was under arrest on suspicion of espionage. Kamal didn't resist. Resistance would only confirm their suspicions. Instead, he expressed outrage and confusion, demanding to know what charges justified this treatment. The officers said nothing, just cuffed his hands and led him down to waiting vehicles. One team escorted him to interrogation facilities. Another team entered his apartment to conduct a comprehensive search. The search took 6 hours. Syrian intelligence methodically dismantled everything. They found the false panels behind the furniture. They found the radio equipment. They found the encryption materials and one-time pads. They found everything that Kamal had successfully hidden for 4 years. The evidence was overwhelming and irrefutable. Kamal Amin Thabet didn't exist. He'd never existed. The man they'd arrested was an Israeli spy who'd penetrated Syrian military and intelligence services at the highest levels. The interrogation started that afternoon in a facility controlled by Syrian military intelligence. They didn't use torture immediately. First, they wanted to understand exactly what they'd caught. Colonel Suidani conducted the initial questioning personally, in laying out the evidence piece by piece. The radio equipment, the encrypted materials, the inconsistencies in the Buenos Aires records, all of it pointing to one conclusion. The man they'd known as Kamal finally acknowledged the truth. His name was Eli Cohen. He was Israeli. He'd been working for Mossad since his arrival in Damascus. Everything about Kamal Amin Thabet had been fabricated. The 4 years of friendship, trust, and access had been one extended deception. Syrian intelligence was stunned by the scope of the penetration. This wasn't some low-level agent passing documents. This was a deep-cover operative who'd been present at their most sensitive military planning sessions, who'd toured their strategic fortifications, who'd built relationships with their senior officers, who knew their war plans, their capabilities, their internal political dynamics. The damage assessment would take months, but the immediate conclusion was catastrophic. Israel had been reading Syria's mail for 4 years. The interrogations continued for weeks. Syrian intelligence wanted to know everything Eli had transmitted, every piece of information he'd gathered, every contact he'd made, every method he'd used. They alternated between psychological pressure and physical torture, trying to extract a complete confession that would allow them to understand the full extent of the compromise. Eli gave them what he had to give: operational details, transmission protocols, some of the intelligence he'd gathered, but he protected his methods and never revealed certain sources or techniques that might compromise future Israeli operations. The interrogation became a brutal negotiation over what he would admit and what he would take to his grave. By February, Syrian authorities had decided Eli's fate. He would be tried publicly for espionage. The trial would serve multiple purposes: humiliate Israel by revealing how thoroughly they'd penetrated Syria, deter future spies by showing the consequences of being caught, and restore Syrian military pride by demonstrating they'd eventually caught the infiltrator. The verdict was predetermined. Eli Cohen would hang. The trial began in late February 1965 in a Damascus military court. The proceedings were theatrical, designed for public consumption rather than justice. Syrian prosecutors presented the evidence methodically: the radio equipment, the encrypted messages, testimony from officers who'd trusted Eli. The prosecution argued that Eli had betrayed Syrian hospitality, corrupted their military planning, and contributed directly to Israeli aggression. His death would be both punishment and deterrence. Eli's defense was minimal. Syrian authorities wouldn't permit a robust legal challenge. His lawyer made pro forma arguments about due process and requested leniency, but everyone in the courtroom understood the outcome was decided. The trial was ritual, not deliberation. The verdict came on March 18, 1965, guilty of espionage. Sentence: death by hanging. The court offered no possibility of appeal. Syrian law provided no clemency for spies working for Israel. Eli Cohen would die publicly to demonstrate that penetrating Syrian intelligence carried an absolute cost. International pressure mounted immediately. Israel couldn't officially acknowledge Eli was their agent. Doing so would compromise other operations and violate intelligence protocols. But they worked through intermediaries. World governments appealed to Syria for clemency. The Pope sent a message requesting mercy. Intelligence services from neutral countries argued that executing Eli would accomplish nothing beyond satisfying revenge. Syria refused every appeal. The political calculation was simple: showing mercy would appear weak, particularly to their own military and intelligence services who'd been humiliated by the penetration. Hanging Eli publicly would restore damaged credibility and send an unmistakable message to anyone considering working for Israeli intelligence: you will be caught, you will be exposed, and you will die. The deterrent value was worth more than any diplomatic cost. Eli spent his final weeks in a Damascus prison cell, writing letters to his wife Nadia that Syrian authorities sometimes allowed to leave the country. The letters were carefully worded. Anything too revealing would be censored. He expressed love for his family. He acknowledged that the life he'd chosen had led inevitably to this conclusion. He asked Nadia to raise their children to understand that he'd died believing the work mattered. The letters contained no regrets, no pleas for rescue that couldn't come, just acceptance that the gamble he'd made in Tel Aviv 5 years earlier was about to claim its final cost. On May 18, 1965, Syrian authorities transported Eli to Marjeh Square in central Damascus. They directed a gallows specifically for the execution, positioning it where thousands of civilians could watch. The public hanging was meant to be a spectacle, a demonstration of Syrian justice, and a warning to anyone who might betray the state. Eli climbed the gallows without resistance. Syrian officials offered him a final opportunity to speak, expecting perhaps a confession or plea for mercy that would further humiliate Israel. Instead, Eli recited the Shema, the central Jewish prayer affirming God's unity. The words carried across the square, audible to the crowd. A final acknowledgement of who he was and what he died defending. The hanging was swift. Syrian authorities weren't interested in prolonging the execution beyond its symbolic purpose. Within minutes, Eli Cohen was dead. His body remained on display for hours, a grotesque warning to anyone watching. Syrian television broadcast footage of the execution, ensuring the message reached every corner of the country. This was the price of spying for Israel. This was the fate that awaited anyone who betrayed Syria. Israel mourned privately. They couldn't acknowledge Eli publicly without compromising ongoing operations, but within the intelligence community, his death marked the end of the most successful penetration of Syrian military planning in Mossad's history. The intelligence he'd provided over 4 years had reshaped Israeli strategic planning. The Golan Heights information alone would prove decisive when war came 2 years later, in 1967. Israeli forces knew exactly which positions to strike, which bunkers to neutralize, which routes to take. They captured the Golan Heights in less than 2 days, neutralizing the strategic threat that had dominated northern Israel for decades. Eli's intelligence had saved that war. His death had made those victories possible. The calculation was brutal, but clear. One life exchanged for thousands. One spy's sacrifice transformed into strategic advantage. Mossad would build monuments to him privately, while denying publicly that he'd ever existed. In the years after his execution, Eli Cohen became a legend in Israeli intelligence, the deep-cover agent who penetrated so thoroughly that Syrian generals had welcomed him as a friend while he documented their war plans. His methods became textbook material for training future agents. His dedication became the standard against which operational commitment was measured. He'd lived the role so completely that even under torture, even facing execution, the mask never fully cracked. Syria eventually acknowledged the strategic damage Eli's penetration had caused. The intelligence he provided about Golan fortifications contributed directly to their catastrophic defeat in 1967. The political turmoil he documented helped Israel understand Syrian vulnerabilities and exploit internal divisions. His 4 years in Damascus had cost Syria a war and reshaped regional power dynamics for decades. But Syria never returned his body. Repeated Israeli requests through intermediaries were refused. Syrian authorities viewed Eli's remains as a final trophy, physical proof of their victory over the spy who'd humiliated them. His grave remained in Syria, unmarked and inaccessible, a reminder that espionage carried permanent costs. For Nadia Cohen, widowed at 30, the loss was both absolute and incomplete. She knew her husband had died a spy. She understood his work had mattered strategically, but she also lived with the hollow absence of someone who'd disappeared into a cover identity so completely that even she'd been kept at distance. The man who'd left for Damascus in 1961 had already stopped being fully Eli Cohen. By the time he died 4 years later, he'd become Camel so thoroughly that recovering the original identity might have been impossible, even if he'd survived. The operation's success came at that price. Complete psychological transformation in service of strategic deception. Eli Cohen had willingly erased himself to become someone Syria would trust. The erasure was so total that nothing remained to reclaim when the operation ended. Just intelligence reports in Tel Aviv's archives and a body in an unmarked Syrian grave. In the history of espionage, few operations achieved what Eli Cohen accomplished in Damascus. He didn't steal documents or recruit other spies. He didn't plant listening devices or hack communications. He did something harder and rarer. He became trusted enough that Syria's military leadership voluntarily shared their most sensitive secrets with him. The intelligence flowed not through technical means, but through relationships built on a foundation of lies so carefully constructed that they became indistinguishable from truth. That was Eli Cohen's real genius, not the spycraft or the radio transmissions or the operational security. It was his ability to inhabit a fictional identity so completely that reality bent around it. Kamel Amin Thabet existed because Eli Cohen made him exist, through thousands of small performances maintained perfectly over 4 years. And when Syria finally discovered the deception, what they found wasn't a spy pretending to be Syrian. They found something more disturbing, an Israeli who'd become Syrian so thoroughly that distinguishing the original from the construction had become impossible. The question that haunted Israeli intelligence afterward was whether the operation could ever be replicated. Could Mossad find another agent capable of that level of sustained psychological transformation? Could they build another cover so perfect that an enemy's military leadership would welcome the agent as a trusted insider? The answer, decades later, remains uncertain. Eli Cohen's penetration of Damascus was either the template for future operations or an unrepeatable historical anomaly made possible by specific circumstances that no longer exist. What's certain is that his death didn't end his impact. The intelligence he gathered continued shaping Israeli strategic planning long after his execution. The lessons from his operation informed Mossad training for generations. His name became synonymous with deep cover success. The agent who'd proven that human intelligence, despite its risks and costs, could achieve what technical collection never could: access to human networks, understanding of decision-making processes, insight into the psychological and political factors that shaped enemy strategy. Eli Cohen died in Damascus on May 18, 1965, but the intelligence he provided lived on, woven into Israeli security calculations that would guide decisions for decades. One spy, 4 years, intelligence that changed a war. The brutal mathematics of espionage reduced to its essential truth. Sometimes one life, willingly sacrificed, can alter the course of nations. Whether that calculation justifies the cost is a question for philosophers and historians. For intelligence services, the calculation is simpler. Eli Cohen's operation was successful. The intelligence proved accurate. The strategic impact was undeniable. He did exactly what Mossad needed him to do. And that success, purchased with his life, became the standard against which every subsequent operation would be measured.